Hello, today we're going to talk about African Americans in the Gilded Age and how their lives were affected. So by the end of this video you'll be able to describe the changes that took place, how it changed their lives, and evaluate to what extent it builds towards our title, was it gilded? Before we do that, we're going to cover something that we've covered in previous lessons. Just take a second. How does the court in New York end up costing $13 million in 1871? It was estimated to have cost $250,000, but the costs rose to $13 million. To put that into perspective, $180,000 was spent on 3 tables and 40 chairs, $40,000 for brooms, $1.5 million for lighting. There is evidence a plasterer received $500,000 for the first job and $1.5 million to repair it. Take a few minutes just to think about how this might link into what we've covered in previous lessons. This connects to the Tweed ring, which I'm sure you enjoy me talking about, and the boss himself. Now, Tammany's Hall standard kickback was $2 for every $1 given to the contractor. So it meant the plasterer would receive $500,000, whereas Tammany Hall would receive $1 million. Tammany Hall is the powerhouse of the Democratic Party in New York. It received votes in response to helping people, and it's evidence of the scale of corruption that was taking place in this period that ended up costing the presidencies. Tweed was estimated to have been responsible for between $40 million and $200 million worth of fraud in this period. To put it into perspective, $40 million is about $1.5 billion in today's money. That gives you a sense of the huge amount of problems that affected the presidencies. I mean, it really did cost the presidency of Hayes and others. And obviously Ulysses Grant himself was so tarred by this that he did not seek a further re-election. The Tweed ring himself. So, on to the main topic for today, African Americans in the Gilded Age. These are some examples of publications at the time. So you have a Valentine's card on the left, you have a nursery rhyme and the book cover in the middle, and on the right hand side it says, "In self-defense, if I hadn't killed you, you'd have grown up to rule me." And I think that really does capture the essence of what we'll be talking about today. Just to recap the period from Reconstruction to the Gilded Age in terms of African Americans, we've got the passing of the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments. That gave the end of slavery, citizenship for African Americans and later voting rights. It was reinforced by the Civil Rights Act in 1866 and the Freedmen's Bureau Act in 1866 as well. The South's reaction to this obviously was very negative. They targeted African Americans in a series of black codes in the 12 states, and radical Reconstruction led to the federal government seizing control of the former Confederacy states. Now, the benefits of this was over 600 African Americans were elected, and that does show the sense of enfranchisement that they had. Remember, African Americans outnumber white Southern racists, and so if they could vote, that was what would happen. Over 600 were returned. Now, it led to backlash. The radicals, such as Thaddeus Stevens, was no match for the White Rage, and we'll look at the growth of the KKK in later sessions. Unfortunately, the election of Hayes versus Tilden in 1877, with the compromise, ended Reconstruction and allowed for the Union troops to be removed from these states. And it really is the start of the Jim Crow period. So just to further build on that, the end of the Civil War, the abolition of slavery, the guarantees with the post-war amendments created the conditions for women, African Americans and others to start press rights for their claims. The US Supreme Court decided 30 constitutional cases in this period. Before the Civil War, there was only 2. They were very busy, and unfortunately, the constitutional cases did not go the way that we'd have wanted. Take a second to look at this image. This is Hiram Rhodes Revels. He was the first senator to be elected of African American descent. He was elected in 1870, served to 1871. So really, if we're looking at this image and this example, then we could say that African Americans' lives improved in this period. In reality, it's very much further from that. Some Supreme Court cases. So United States versus Cruikshanks, 1876. In this, the court overturned the convictions of whites who had murdered hundreds of African Americans. Convictions were made under the Enforcement Act of 1870, which is also known as the KKK Act. The Supreme Court decided that it applied only to state action, not private individuals, and so their convictions were overturned. It's a huge turning factor in the Supreme Court's treatment of African Americans. It's reinforced in United States versus Harris in 1883 and the civil rights cases. The court nullified major provisions of the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 and the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Because of these losses, the federal government effectively withdrew from civil rights enforcement until 1957. So we can say within this period of the Gilded Age, African Americans lose the protection of the federal government in an extent, and that's partially due to the Supreme Court and partially due to other factors. Now, the most famous case in this period is Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. In 1890, some background information, Louisiana passed a law that stopped the mixing of races on its railroads. A New Orleans resident group of African and mixed race heritage challenged the law. Homer Plessy, who was a Creole in New Orleans, he was only 1/8 black by their definitions. He looked white by all appearances. He sat in a white-only train car. He was tracked down by detectives who discovered his black heritage, and he was jailed. The case that was taken on reached the Supreme Court, and the decision that was made would bind the southern states for the next 50 years. By a 7-1 majority, so 7 votes for to 1 vote against, the 14th Amendment was essentially quashed. The 14th Amendment was to enforce the equality of races in the eyes of the law, not to distinguish distinctions of colour. So this said that the 14th Amendment that gave civil rights to African Americans was there not to distinguish race, but to protect these things. Some quotes. We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamp the coloured races with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the coloured races choose to put that construction upon it. So, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decided that separate but equal was acceptable, that it was going to be perfectly constitutionally allowed for a state to establish black and white only facilities. And so in this period we see a huge raft of changes that follow this separate but equal. Just wanted to take a minute to look at Justice John Marshall Harlan, who dissented, who was that one person against the other 7. The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in the country, and so it is in prestige, in achievements, in education, in wealth and power. So I doubt not it will continue to be for all time. However, our Constitution is colourblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. Had more of the Supreme Court followed the same view, then Plessy versus Ferguson would not have established the separate but equal allowances. It led to a period of further segregation in the South. Segregation of courtrooms, jails, prisons, restaurants, trains, buses, public restrooms. These laws, coupled with segregated private lives, inevitably resulted in 2 separate and decidedly unequal societies, and we will study the effects of the Jim Crow and Plessy versus Ferguson in later lessons. Now, one way in which African American lives grew worse was the disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South. Remember, African Americans outnumbered white voters in the South, so denying black men the right to vote was important for white control of these states. By the 1890s, most of the Confederate states now had literacy tests, poll taxes, and registration systems that effectively stopped African Americans from voting. An example is 1877 in Georgia. There was a law passed that meant there was a tax placed on people on places where people voted. That essentially meant that black African Americans had to pay to vote. The results of this were in Mississippi, fewer than 9,000 of 147,000 African Americans who were able to vote were registered to vote. In Louisiana, 130,000 in 1896, but by 1904, just 1,342. So you can see the effects of the the literacy tests, the poll taxes, and the registration systems. By this period, African Americans were starting to be disenfranchised. That means their vote was taken away from them. Remember, that vote was granted by the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. In this period, we also see a rise in lynchings in the South. Now, lynchings are the attack of mobs against individuals. According to a 5-year study published in 2015 by the Equal Justice Initiative, 3,959 black men, women and children were lynched in the 12 southern states. A Tuskegee Institute put that number at 3,446 blacks and 1,297 whites lynched between this period. And these were people that were accused of a crime that did not have the opportunity to face their accusers in a court, but instead they were murdered by mobs. Now, African Americans in this period did gain some advances. They were very far and few between, but there was some benefits. Now, there was movement of African Americans. There was mass exoduses from the southern states. There were new surnames, new titles. There was the right to marry. There was establishment of churches, and there was the creation of better education systems. So between 1866 and 1868, 3 new universities for African Americans were created. However, mixed schools were discouraged. So much so that 50% of African Americans in the South were still illiterate, and that's a different statistic to the one that was going to be coming up in the conclusion. One individual who's influential in this period is Booker T. Washington. He was an advocate for moderation and compromise, the first leader of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and he trained African American teachers. He saw education as the golden bullet, with the ability to end segregation and to re-establish African Americans' place in society. He was committed to the benefits of education. He advised blacks to accept the Jim Crow laws to avoid confrontation, and it was that statement that led him to be criticised by radical African Americans who wanted more radical approaches to ending the segregation that happened. So a summary: literacy improved in the whole of America. 1865 it was at 5% for African Americans. By 1895 it was 50% of African Americans could read and write. Remember, in the South, the 12 states, 50% could not. So we see the disparity between the North and the South even further here. There was a rise in African American religious organisations. There was a growth in banking systems, insurances, societies and companies. Lots of small businesses that were run by African Americans were established in this period. We see an emerging middle class. By 1900, 47,000 African Americans were professionals. They had degrees. They were doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists. And by this time, we see an emergence of positive African American culture. Lastly, a summary of the negatives. There was growth of segregated transport from 1881. Tennessee rail cars is the start of it. Booker T. Washington approved it as a means to boost black identity. Plessy versus Ferguson supported segregation legally. There was a growth in segregated districts in the North and the South. For instance, in Chicago, 5,000 African Americans, Harlem, 23,000 African Americans, and they would start to live in urban centres that later becomes the slums and the ghettos that we'll talk about. There was exclusion from voting through registration qualifiers, grandfather clauses, poll taxes. By 1901, the last black congressman, George H. White, retired, meaning there was no African Americans in Congress. Mob rule grew in the South. There was lynchings, violence, and it was starting to be ignored by authorities. Most African Americans lacked expertise and the money necessary to emigrate, but conversely, 40,000 still did manage to do so. And there was a number of false arrests and imprisonments, a disproportionate number of African Americans in the chain gangs in prison and labour camps. And that was seen by many as a way of controlling them. Remember, that's how the Black Code started, by dealing with vagrancy that affected African Americans much more. So to summarise, the Gilded Age, on the face of it, is covered in gold. When we dig deeper, we see the divisions in society, the divisions between women, the divisions with African Americans, the division between immigrants and nativists. And really, when it comes to answering a question on this, you've got lots of information to draw on, whether it's about immigrants specifically, whether it's about African Americans specifically. Okay, thank you very much.